morning, everybody. Dear President Karayancheva, dear Vice President Dombrovskis, honourable members of the national parliaments, dear colleagues, members of the European Parliament. It's a pleasure to see you assembled here for the 7th edition of the European Parliamentary Week. Organised annually, it is the biggest interparliamentary event in our calendar. This year, 123 members from 27 EU member states, representing 36 parliamentary chambers, are present. This includes 4 candidate countries, as well as Norway and Switzerland. National parliaments play a key role in bringing EU policies closer to citizens, a goal I set for my mandate as President of the European Parliament. We must find ways to increase citizen trust and confidence in our Union and its institutions. We must deliver a new vision for the future of Europe and propose concrete action that refer the EU in the coming years for the benefit of all Europeans. To achieve this, the European Parliament's long-held view is that interparliamentary cooperation and the exchange of best practices between assemblies are crucial in nurturing the debate on the future of the European Union. Please allow me to continue in my mother tongue. In questi 2 giorni,
over the next 2 days, we'll be discussing the efficiency of the European semester, the coordination of European economic policies, stability, growth, and economic governance. The increase in economic growth after 10 years of crisis is undoubtedly good news, but we see that there's an increasing gap between the rich and the poor and between developed areas and regions and the laggard regions. A great percentage of wealth is in the hands of the 15% of the population, which is the wealthiest, and these disparities don't lead to enough job opportunities, especially for young people. 23 million between 15 and 34 years of age are not studying and not working. The middle classes are finding it more and more difficult, and the new generations have worse prospects than their parents, and this is a first. Over the last few years, there have been similar trends in the global economy. Free circulation of capital and more open markets have, among others, promoted competitiveness, but have also led to unfair competition and have pushed down environmental and labor standards. Migration, which is often not controlled, and other issues have led to great problems and to great frustration. People feel socially excluded and disillusioned. The only way of fighting against this rage is to come up with concrete solutions, and we can only come up with these solutions if we are united. It is only by working together that we can really provide solutions to problems that are of a cross-border nature. And we have to make sure that we are global players on the international stage, like China, the Russian Federation, US, or India. The main challenge that we have ahead of us is twofold. It's not enough to boost economic growth. It is just as important to make sure that this economic growth provides dividends when it comes to prosperity and job opportunities for as many people as possible. This is the only way of honoring freedom and dignity of the person, which are our founding values, because this has to be done also through work. The digital revolution, the AI revolution, have caused a sea change when it comes to work and competitiveness. So we need to have policies that flank this process, helping industry, but also workers by making sure that we invest in training and education so that we can help these workers get new skills. We need to look at digital platforms as well. An internet giant cannot decide what happens on its own when it comes to tax, transparency, workers' rights, privacy, and consumer protection. In order to be credible and in order to make sure that there's prosperity and well-being, we have to make sure that we have tax fairness and justice. If we want there to be fairness and economic growth, we need to continue building this project. We have laid the foundations with the internal market and the euro as a main pillar, but we have our work cut out for us. There is so much more to do. The market has to develop its potential in areas such as services, energy, and digital technology. We have to create jobs, boost SMEs, and help consumers, and contribute to reducing the disparities between the less developed regions and the wealthier regions. Together with the Capital Market Union and Banking Union, we have to move forward with the Fiscal Union and Economic and Political Union. We cannot share the same currency without making sure that there is more uniform competitiveness and that we don't have economic and social convergence. So we have to reduce economic and financial risk and have shared tools. In February last year, the European Parliament adopted 3 reports in order to improve the economic governance in the EU. We are in favor of an EU finance minister that would coordinate action and reform so that we can have higher growth and reforms. We need to look at public spending, investment, research to make sure that the EU is the most competitive economic area in the world. The European Parliament has said that it's in favor of making sure that we have a proper EMF, to turn the ESM into an EMF so that we can facilitate structural reform. But we need transparent economic governance, which is also democratic. That is why the European Parliament and national parliaments have to be more and more involved in the decision-making procedures, and we have to cooperate more and more amongst ourselves. This year, as President of the European Parliament, I have done everything I can to make sure that all EU decisions have at their heart the forum that represents the European peoples. The European Parliament is the first and foremost institution of the EU, and we have to have power of scrutiny. We have to monitor what the European Commission is doing. We're not here just to rubber stamp from what is coming from nearby buildings. We are co-lawmakers, and we want to do all of this working hand in hand with the national parliaments. And of course, they have to keep an eye on what we're doing in order to make sure that we're respecting the principle of subsidiarity. This is valuable cooperation that puts citizens at the heart of all political action. Because if the European Parliament, if national parliaments lose this role, then European citizens are no longer at the heart of our project. And that, of course, undermines the whole spirit of democracy. That is why I believe that in this very delicate phase, we have to be cautious. Emotions are running high in the European Union at the moment, and that is why it is extremely important to have the European Parliament do its work. And the work that it's doing and the work that the national parliaments are doing is extremely important, because parliaments are the link between the executive power and the people. And that is why we have to work in the interests of our citizens. The goal of this European Parliamentary Week is to involve national parliaments more and more. The two panels that will take place after this speech will play a very important role. The first will look at the role of national parliaments when we shift from the ESM to an EMF, and the second one will be debating the next multi-annual financial framework, the MFF. I think that the next budget will have to be one of a political nature and will have to provide concrete answers to meet the concerns of citizens such as youth unemployment, illegal migration, and has to come up with tools to provide security and defense, and will also have to tackle climate change. The EU budget can't just be a tool for distribution. We have to make sure we continue believing in the cohesion policy, and the budget has to have policy priorities. It has to provide added value so we can overcome this bump on the road, so that we can overcome the crisis and provide answers to our citizens. By adopting the three reports I referred to, and by signing the Rome Declaration on the 25th of March last year, we triggered a debate on the future of Europe. The European Parliament has been very much involved in this by inviting certain heads of state and government to come here. We had the TSOC from Ireland, and then in April we'll also have the Portuguese Prime Minister and the French President coming to plenary. We want to hear ideas and proposals from them. We think that this is an encouraging signal. It sends out a message of transparency and will allow the European Parliament once again to be at the center of the debate on the future of Europe. This isn't about the future of bureaucracies. This is about the future of 500 million men and women who live within the European borders. We want an open debate, and that is why we want to strengthen the democratic process. We want stronger ties between us and you, and that is why I would like to thank you very much for coming here today.
Karayancheva, President of the National Assembly of the Republic of Bulgaria. The floor is yours.
President Tajani, Commissioner Dombrovskis, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As the President of the National Assembly of the Republic of Bulgaria, I would like to express my pleasure at this opportunity to co-preside the Interparliamentary Conference on Stability and Economic Governance of the European Union. This is the third event related to the interparliamentary dimension of the Bulgarian presidency, and the first event that is taking place here in Brussels in the European Parliament. And I would like to thank our hosts for their hospitality. What brings us together here today is working together in order to achieve financial stability and sustainable growth of the economy of the European Union. It is a pleasure and honor to open the session related to the strengthening of the resilience and the stabilization of the economic and monetary union. None of us agrees to the idea of a two-speed Europe or a multi-speed Europe, and in the spirit of the Rome Declaration, I would like to call for unity now more than ever, and our motto, the motto of the Bulgarian presidency, is also the motto of Bulgaria. United we stand strong. The multi-annual financial framework is a particularly important issue. Deepening the Eurozone integration and the strategic vision for the economic governance of the European Union are other crucial subjects. Through its joint policies, the European Union co-finances a number of key sectors in the economies of the member states, thus contributing to their economic and social developments. At the same time, we face significant challenges, and we need to be able to be flexible and efficient. That is why I would like to state here that Bulgaria, during its presidency, is working for furthering the integration of the economic and monetary union. This is a process that is inextricably connected with democratic accountability of the Eurozone institutions to the elected representatives of the citizens of the European Union. That is why I am very glad that we are talking about a new approach, and we're deepening the discussions on the subject that we're discussing today. And within the joint discussions of the subject of the European prospects and a better combination of the monetary policy and national fiscal policies is a particularly important issue. We need to focus on issues specific for the Eurozone without having different policies overlap in the same area. The European Union is going to benefit if more member states become also members of the Eurozone. President Juncker has already stated that very clearly. We also need to talk about the future of the European Union after the exit of the UK. This is one of the most important net donors to the budget of the European Union, and we need to talk about how Brexit is going to affect the funding for the policies of the European Union and the multi-annual financial framework. This is going to have its effects all over the European Union, and one of the major priorities of the Bulgarian presidency is the reduction of economic and social differences among and within member states. That is why I insist that cohesion policy should keep its prominent place in the budget of the European Union after 2020, because it is a policy that connects investment via European structures and investment funds and structural reforms and good economic governance on the other hand. I believe that this policy is a particularly important policy for all of us, and that is why it's a priority for us, because we need to bridge the differences. That is why I welcome the effort of the Bulgarian government and the member states and the European institutions to reduce risks in the banking sector and to continue on the road of completing the banking union. We're also working on the capital markets union in order to achieve a good balance between funding coming from banks and funding coming from other sources, and also in order to strengthen the resilience of the banking system and create new opportunities for the SMEs, which are practically the structure of the European economy. In conclusion, I would like to say that the key to the stabilization and the prosperity within the economic and monetary union is efficient communication among member states. I believe that if we act responsibly, if we act in a balanced way, and if we are constructive and ambitious, we can achieve this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President. And now the next speaker, the Vice President of the European Commission, Valdis Dombrovskis, responsible for the Euro and the social dialogue. You have the floor.
Dear Presidents Tajani and Karyancheva, honourable members of Parliament, I'm delighted to address you on the deepening of the economic and monetary union. The debate is in full swing, and prospects for making progress in reforming EMU are better than they had been for a long time, which, by the way, still doesn't mean that it would be easy. This is therefore a very timely debate. The economic backdrop is good, as we are in a 6th year of economic growth, and the economic growth has returned to all EU member states. Growth surpassed expectations last year and continues to gather pace. Both the euro area and EU as a whole are estimated to have expanded by 2.4% in 2017, the fastest pace in the decade. This robust performance is set to continue in 2018 and 19 with 2.3 and 2% growth respectively. So one can say that the European economy enjoys a robust health. Unemployment is the lowest it has been in a decade. Strong demand, high capacity utilisation and supportive financing conditions are set to favour further investment and hence create more opportunities going forward. Confidence among businesses and consumers is strong and could drive our economic performance even higher in the near future. Of course, there are downside risks as well, as stock market volatility recently showed, but we see them as broadly balanced in the short term. In the medium term, high global asset prices could still be vulnerable to reassessment of risks and fundamentals, and political uncertainty remains, chiefly as a result of Brexit negotiations, geopolitical tensions, and the risk of shift towards more inward-looking or even protectionist policies internationally. Let me also note that the situation differs greatly across countries, as recovery started much earlier in some countries than in others, and the legacy of the crisis, continued high debt and unemployment, is concentrated in some countries. But overall, Europe's economic outlook is good, and there is a time to show that we can act even outside of the crisis. Dear colleagues, the Commission has presented its vision for EMU in the 5 Presidents' report of 2015, as well as in its reflection paper on deepening the EMU published last year. There have been extensive discussions in the European Council and Parliament, and I would like to use this occasion also to thank national parliaments for their suggestions and reflections they have contributed. This is highly appreciated. The package presented last December offers a roadmap for action and several concrete proposals building on these debates and the most pressing needs. We stress the idea of roadmap because we should act in the short term, but also have a clear vision and determination for the medium and longer term, a sense of direction where EMU should be going beyond 2019 all the way to 2025. The 3 guiding principles for the Commission are very clear: unity, efficiency and democratic accountability. Unity, because the futures of both euro and non-euro member states are already intertwined, and all non-euro member states, with the exception of UK and Denmark, are legally committed to joining the euro eventually. All new instruments which we presented would be open to all member states. Efficiency, as the EMU requires stronger governance and more efficient use of available tools, and democratic accountability, as we need greater political responsibility and transparency about who decides what, and greater dialogue across national and European stakeholders involving European and national parliaments, social partners and civil society. We have one more full legislative year to go before the European elections, and we have to use it to the full to make real advances. It would be a missed opportunity not to do so. The December roadmap recalls that an urgent priority in is finalising the banking union. We welcome the leaders' political commitment to prioritise it, together with reinforcement of the ESM. Progress in this area is only viable if risk reduction and risk sharing go hand in hand. The first is work of continuous progress. Europe needs to further strengthen and diversify its banking sector so that it can fully play its role in financing the economy. We need bank lending and integrated capital markets for companies to invest and remain competitive, and for households to plan ahead. More than a year ago, we presented a comprehensive risk reduction package of reforms to further strengthen the resilience of EU banks. Meanwhile, the Commission, together with a single supervisory mechanism, closely monitors the sector's health, and indeed a lot of progress has been made in recent years. Last month, we reported on the progress on the state of play of non-performing loans across Europe. We found that over the last 3 years, the share of NPLs had been reduced by 1/3. In the latest figures, as of mid-2017, the NPL ratio stands at 4.6% for EU as a whole. But there are still large differences among the countries. However, we also note important progress in member states that initially had very high rates of non-performing loans or were lagging in reforms. We will continue to work with member states to accelerate this positive trend. Next month, we will present proposals on how to reduce non-performing loans and to prevent their accumulation in the future. This will also enable progress in parallel on creating a common backstop for a single resolution fund, already agreed in principle in 2013, and a European deposit insurance scheme. This is vital to strengthen the EMU. Strong common protection of deposits, even when a crisis hits a member state, will help to avoid bank runs, limit contagion, and reduce the overall cost of crisis management. I am very much aware of legitimate concerns that a common deposit insurance scheme should not create moral hazard. The Commission has presented several possible ideas to take these concerns into account and move towards EDIS in a more gradual way. Hence, EDIS could become a tool for both risk sharing and risk reduction. Coming to the proposals of December. First, we set out a concrete proposal of how to transform a European Stability Mechanism into a European Monetary Fund. This will further strengthen its institutional anchoring. It will help to create new synergies within EU framework, and notably in terms of transparency, accountability and efficiency of EU's financial resources. The EMF would also provide a backstop for a single resolution fund. I would like to underline one important point. Our proposal does not change the decision-making or budgetary architecture of the current European Stability Mechanism. They reflect a delicate balance of interests and have proven effective over the years. The lines of accountability to national governments and parliaments fully remain. The second initiative is a proposal to integrate into the EU legal framework the substance of the Treaty of Stability, Coordination and Governance in the EMU, which includes the Fiscal Compact. We hereby put the signatory member states in a position to fulfil their intention to integrate the instrument as spelled out in the treaty itself. Integrating intergovernmental instruments into Union legal framework will simplify the legal framework and diminish the risk of duplication. This will only strengthen the sense of accountability, as the proposal safeguards the role of national parliaments and interparliamentary discussions like the one we have this week. In fact, the Fiscal Compact is primarily a way to strengthen national procedures for sound public finances. The Commission proposal does not affect the secondary law regarding the Stability and Growth Pact. We also need to modernise our EU public finances to better respond to current challenges. Last week we have given our input for a discussion at the next summit on post-2020 multi-annual financial framework, including on how EU's finances can better support national reforms and investment. In our EMU roadmap, we highlighted first a new reform delivery tool, giving member states additional support and incentives to implement national reforms agreed with the Commission. We will present a proposal in the context of next MFF, therefore for a post-2020 period. However, such support could be tested already now for a period 2018-2020 by mobilising on voluntary basis, so fully optional, parts of the performance reserve of the European structural and investment funds. This will be possible if the Parliament and Council adopt our proposed legislative amendment to Common Provision Regulation of EU funds. Second, we want to beef up our technical support to reform implementation at the request of Member States. For the period 2018-2020, we are proposing to increase the budget of the newly set up Structural Reform Support Programme by some €80 million on top of the €142 million already available. This programme has proved very popular since its start. Already now it supports 150 projects in 15 Member States, and we are now in the process of selecting new projects for this year. For 2018, demand came from more than 20 Member States and exceeded the available budget by a factor of 5. Third, a dedicated convergence facility for Member States on their way to joining the Euro. For Euro to prosper and for countries to prosper within Euro area, we need to make convergence happen. We can do more through technical support upon the request of the country in question, targeted at those areas where it can help achieve a high degree of convergence, such as public financial management, the business environment, financial sector, labour and product markets, and public administrations. First, we propose to set up Euro area fiscal stabilisation function, which we see aimed at maintaining investment levels in the event of large asymmetric shocks. Such a stabilisation function would provide the possibility to activate resources rapidly from Member States to complement the role of national budgets. Investment is often cut first from the national budgets in times of strain, with detrimental effects of longer-term productivity and growth. The support will come from different sources of funding at the EU level, mainly loans. This will make these ideas more concrete in a legislative proposal to come together with the one on a post-2020 multi-annual financial framework. Let me stress that such a stabilisation function should minimise moral hazard and not lead to permanent transfers. Also, there should be clear eligibility criteria. It is crucial that Member States continue building fiscal buffers, especially in good times. Finally, with a medium-term perspective, the Commission also suggested creating the position of European Minister of Economy and Finance. The Minister would strengthen the European dimension of economic policy making and ensure strong parliamentary scrutiny at EU level without calling into question national competences. Ladies and gentlemen, honourable colleagues, ever since the Five Presidents' report, we put emphasis on democratic legitimacy of our economic and fiscal policy coordination, and on the EMU as such. Intense cooperation with the European Parliament is one aspect of that. Consultation and discussion with national parliaments throughout the decision-making process is another. And the tight bond between the European Parliament and its national counterparts is a third. A complete EMU can only be democratic EMU. The European Parliamentary Week is an ideal setting to debate how to keep fine-tuning the transparency and accountability of the process and how this should find institutional form. So with a couple of important months ahead of us, I hope we can count on your active support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President Dombrovskis. The Vice President will leave the Parliament at 10:15 for the Eurogroup. For this, we start immediately with the debate. 7 speeches, 2 minutes, please. Le premier est Monsieur
Eric Woerth, President, Chairman of the Finance Committee in the French Parliament.
Thank you, President. Well, of course, we need progress in the short term on a number of subjects, but I see 3 which are relevant to this conference. First of all, as said, Vice President, is to ensure that we can master the risk. I'm thinking of the banking union, uniforming, having harmonisation of capital markets. Now, secondly, the European budget, which is too small and too inflexible. You have to, of course, respect the identity of each country, and there are some policies which have been in place for a long time, but we need a larger budget and more intervention capacity. And the third point is to avoid fiscal unfairness within the European Union and within the Eurozone, there can't be such behaviour. I'm thinking of something we spoke about yesterday, the digital fiscality. There shouldn't be such a long time between political decisions and the economic decisions which are taken afterwards. And we've seen in our parliaments, in our countries, but it's probably all the more visible within the European Union. And so I would like to know, what is the real precise time frame for the European Union to provide a clear answer to this phenomenon, which is ongoing and which makes the economy in Europe unfair? And this means that those extremely wealthy don't pay, they hardly pay any tax or very little on the products they make. Thank you.
Gianpaolo Galli from the Italian Parliament.
My Parliament has already approved the December package of the Commission, 99% of it, and I personally very much agree with the consideration of Vice President Dombrovskis within the broader context of the speech given to us by President Tajani. So I can just want to point out one single point. There have been a number of proposals floating around in Europe, not by in-charge officials, of introducing a rule for automatic restructuring of debts, of national public debts. This has been in paper by a very respectable person, the former Minister of Finance of Germany, Mr. Schäuble, when he resigned. There has been a paper recently of French and German economists. Let me say that this would be the opposite of the title of our session, Strengthening Resilience. This would destabilize, create destabilization in the euro area. Debt restructuring may be a necessity in some cases, but if you define rules for it, you run the risk of making a self-fulfilling prophecy. Let me also say that debt restructuring works if it is definitive. In other words, if the next day the government doesn't have to tap the markets in order to fund its needs. So that requires something like, in some countries, debt restructuring, cutting the debt by 50% or so, which would create an enormous depression, not just in the country itself, but all over Europe. So we don't want to have self-fulfilling prophecies like, to a large extent, was the famous beach walk or promenade of Deauville by leaders Sarkozy and Merkel, which did contribute to the problems of the euro area. Let me make an easy prediction. If some relevant European or national authority in the next few weeks or days will make statements about debt, automatic debt restructuring or a rule to do that, then Europe runs the risk of being badly destabilized. I don't know if it's destabilized in the same way as it happens after the Deauville promenade, but very badly destabilized, so I really hope that nothing will happen. Thank you.
Ora il vicepresidente del Parlamento europeo.
Mr. Papadimoulis, Vice President of the European Parliament. Thank you very much, President. Now that the European economy is doing better, Vice President Dombrovskis, then I think we need to move forward with deepening and unification of the union that we have, because the economic union we have hasn't been completed, the banking union hasn't been completed either, and the currency union hasn't either. So we have to bolster these unions and make sure that they become stronger in view of the crisis that might happen. So, as you said, as President Juncker said, it's not raining now, so let us build the roof now, because later it will be too late. Secondly, we also have to move forward with tax harmonization. Look at what scandals there have been, the Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, so much has been revealed. Journalists have revealed all of this information, and I think that state budgets and European budgets cannot ignore this. We are losing millions of euro because the wealthy are going forward with tax avoidance. So it is legal on paper, but it is unfair and unethical. So I think that's why we have to push forward with tax harmonization. We can't have member states with their own tax systems with black holes that harm other countries. So the EU has to do now the whole issue of the EU doing more with less. Over the last few years, we've had more challenges: the migration crisis, the fight against terrorism, and the fact that we have to invest more in research and innovation. So let me say that I agree with the Speaker of the Bulgarian Parliament. If we want to protect the cohesion policy, I'm almost done, President, then those countries who benefit the most from the EU and are the wealthiest, such as the Netherlands and Germany, have to pay more into the European budget. And secondly, we need to get more own resources. We need to make the most of the Monti group proposals.
From the Danish Parliament, and then the Commissioner, Vice President Dombrovskis. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And I think it was me. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us here. I'm so happy to be here. And may I start by saying something a bit different? I'm a big fan of the European Union. For me, as a child of the Cold War, getting so many countries part of the European Union is a sign of democracy in Europe. It's a sign of peace and progress. But I'm worried when countries start to leave the European Union, when more people disagree with the European Union. I get worried about our project, because I believe in the peace, in the democracy that the European Union should make. I also worry about the countries who try to roll back on some of the negative freedom rights. And I think it's also necessary for the European Union to look at these things and try and help them ahead. Try to see what can we do to stop these things from happening. How can we get more people to be interested and believing in the European Union? But back to the things we're talking about concretely right now. I think it's very positive with reforms. In Denmark, we made several reforms over the last 15 years. We have made a later retirement age. We have made a more flexible labor market. And all these things we have done to create more positive public finances, so that we won't have problems with the economy in Denmark. And we think it's necessary that all countries look at their own countries and see how can we help to make sure that we have positive finances in our countries. It's a national assignment to do that, but I think it's good if the European Union can assist in how you can do these things. We also have an issue about inequality in Denmark. And about inequality, we try to make so little inequality as possible, also geographically. And that's also a national assignment you find very important. And of course, we always would like to assist with good ideas and stuff like that. But we do think it's an assignment for our country, and we would like to do it ourselves. Thank you.
Vice President Dombrovskis, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, honourable members of Parliament. So, first of all, thank you for the support on our work on completing the banking union and capital markets union. Indeed, it's also a priority for the European Commission, and we think we can find tangible results on this really soon. As regards the question which was raised on the timeline of decision making, so as regards our deepening of EMU work, we see several important milestones, including the March Euro Summit, the summit in June, where we hope to draw already some agreements from our December deepening of EMU package, And finally, we are going to have a summit in May 2019 in Sibiu, where we hope to draw conclusions as regards the future of Europe, at least within this parliamentary term. So we are expecting, as I was saying, a couple of quite important months ahead of us. Then several members raised a question on the EU budget, on EU budget priorities, EU budget size. Indeed, as you know, European Commission recently came forward with its contributions to this discussion of the next MFF, and this is also our opinion that we are faced with substantial challenges, as also Brexit leaves quite a substantial hole in a budget. So we must move beyond this traditional speaking of EU budget not more than 1% of GNI. Clearly, it should be more. And actually, to address this Brexit hole in a budget and to address the new priorities, it will require both. It will require some reprioritization of existing expenditure, and it will require a larger size of EU budget. And so Commission is working on both directions. As regards own resources, indeed, it's also our attention to put forward ideas for potential new own resources. Question was raised on automatic restructuring of sovereign debt. If you look at the proposals of the European Commission, you see that the European Commission is not proposing that kind of mechanism. We are, of course, very aware of this discussion, and we also consider that this discussion should be dealt with caution, not to undermine financial stability, and being aware of potential adverse effects. Indeed, our aim is to strengthen the resilience of the EMU as it was highlighted. The question of taxation also was addressed by several speakers, and it must be said Commission fully agrees. In terms of taxation, we have many things to do, and actually we have reached already quite substantial progress during the last couple of years with the amendments to the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive, strengthening the provisions against tax avoidance, with agreements on exchange of information among member states and also with third countries, with the implementation of OECD initiative to fight against base erosion and profit shifting, with VAT reform package, which also is addressing very substantial VAT fraud, including international VAT fraud, which we are facing on our proposal with on public country-by-country reporting, on our proposal with common consolidated corporate tax base. Soon we'll be putting forward a proposal on digital taxation to address our corporate taxation to the new digital era. So indeed, in taxation, we have a very intensive agenda, and we must implement this principle that tax is paid where real economic activity is taking place. And finally, thank you for the remarks and points made in strengthening the role of also member states and national parliaments and national governments as regards sound economic and fiscal policy making. And that's something we are also emphasizing, that we can improve the institutional setting of economic and monetary union. We can strengthen the tools at EU level, but they cannot be a replacement for sound fiscal and macroeconomic policy making at the national level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President Dombrovskis, for your engagement. And now, before the coffee break, 3 speeches. The first is Mrs. Peric from Croatia.
So, thank you for your attention. Produbljivanje ekonomske i monetarne unije.
The deepening of the EMU is important for Croatia, which is not yet a member of the euro area. As Prime Minister Plenković in his address to the European Parliament pointed out, joining the Eurozone is a strategic goal of Croatia. The government of Croatia and the Croatian National Bank have presented a strategy of introducing the euro, which opens up the public debate, which is now being carried out in all cities in Croatia, with the goal of identifying the benefits of joining the Eurozone for the citizens of Croatia. Croatia is currently meeting all the requirements for joining the Eurozone, and this is why we deem very important the proposals from the package of deepening the EMU, with the objective of setting up the European Monetary Fund, of increasing the funds for the program for support to structural reforms, which introduces also financial support to member states in enacting the necessary reforms to meet the criteria for joining the Eurozone. Thirdly, we welcome the new instrument of support to structural reforms. In June 2017, Croatia emerged from the excessive deficit procedure, and we are now continuing to enact the national reform program with the objective of achieving convergence with the Eurozone and removing the macroeconomic imbalances. In this context, we especially support the pilot stage from the period until 2020 of the new support mechanism, which will allow member states to tap into the existing reserves from ESI funds, and after 2020, this will be part of the future financial perspective, which is now set apart from the ESI funds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Paavo Arimäki from the Finnish Parliament. You have the floor. Micro, please.
Kiitos, arvoisa.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Tajani raised an issue that citizens trust and belief in the EU is an important matter, and we have seen over the last years, during the crisis, that confidence in the EU has weakened, but also the same goes with national decision taking. Of course, people are suffering from economic financial cuts, no future, unemployment. Of course, your trust will be weakened. If the EU wants to increase that trust and confidence of our citizens, we have to tackle these issues. For instance, what is the EU's role? What is the ECB's role in enhancing employment, in enhancing investments? If we think about the European Central Bank's role, at present the role is very minimal, even though now they have been doing against their traditional role, and that has been good, and we see it in the economic growth. Another point of view, another angle here is that EU economic policy that has forced to cut, especially from the weakest in our societies, that will not strengthen that confidence. Let's think about my own country situation. In Finland, we have given tax cuts to wealthy citizens. For instance, for parliamentarians, it was lowered by 3%. But at the same time, pensioners and students and young people suffer. Mr. President, another thing is that we have to tackle tax dumping, wage dumping, social dumping. LuxLeaks, Panama Papers, they all show how much illegally people avoid taxes. Far too much we have legal tax avoidance. Here in the EU we have our own tax havens here, and the EU cannot stand, and our social systems and welfare systems can't stand it when we start the race to the bottom as regards taxes. Therefore, Mr. Dombrovskis, there were some good points about how to tackle EU inner tax dumping as regards corporate taxation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Christos Staikouras from the Greek Parliament. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. leaders, with delays, compromises and high social costs, managed to drive Europe gradually and steadily out of the crisis. However, the EU still faces major challenges such as high unemployment, high public and private debt, the demographic problem, the refugee crisis, internal and external security, Brexit, financial stability, the direction of monetary policy. The collective answer should be a more resilient, competitive, efficient and qualitative Europe with enhanced solidarity. By deepening and strengthening EMU, better economic coordination, adequate tools and resources to tackle imbalances, concrete rules for long-term economic governance. What is needed entitles the implementation of responsible fiscal policies, indeed taking into account the economic cycle, the adoption of realistic fiscal targets and the improvement of public finances composition with a reduction of tax burden and better expenditure control, contrary to what occurs in Greece. The implementation of consistent structural reforms that will improve competitiveness, the reduction of economic deviations based on social market economic principles, the finalisation of the banking union and the advancement of a fully fledged capital market union to enhance liquidity. And finally, the transformation of the ESM into a European Monetary Fund as a fiscal stabilisation mechanism with sufficient lending and borrowing capacity and the possibility of developing new financial instruments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Gabriela Cretu from the Romanian Senate. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, President. Dear friends, we don't have yet a single currency. We have only a common currency in an area with wide disparities, acting as a kind of sponge, absorbing added value from poorer to richer member states. A common currency could work, however, when these disparities are reduced, applying consistent cohesion and convergence policies. Or we are witnessing a change of paradigm from solidarity to state responsibility. But state responsibility cannot be greater than its capacity to intervene and control the results, including having monetary instruments of intervention. As member states have already transferred and shared competences, we need appropriate European instruments of intervention instead. Solidarity instruments are still poor. Mutualisation of common risks we face together in the single market is still absent. Worrying ideas are instead launched. A group of economists, I hope not advising the European Commission, wants European safe bonds. That means CDOs, that kind of instruments with junior and senior levels, which produces the financial crisis. We promote a very limited understanding of discipline, punishing member states and undermining public sector and services, seeing MTOs and Maastricht criteria as a kind of must-do intangible. The crisis has shown us that the states respectful with this criteria, the model students, far from being protected, have suffered the negative effects at an undeserved level. Our Spanish and Irish friends could be witnesses. Those far less attentive to strict criteria easily coped with the crisis. It is a piece of proof that we are applying wrong policies. Perhaps the balance of payments, it is much more relevant, especially since the surplus of one represents the deficit of another. And paying attention, please, is needed to private sector. Its high level of debts and the structure of private investments, as we have seen in the past, they could produce crisis. Thank you.
The last speaker before the coffee break is Mr. Skopeček from the Czech Republic. You have the floor.
Děkuji pěkně za slovo.
Thank you, Chair. Today we are discussing proposals on strengthening the Eurozone and strengthening the stabilization of the Eurozone. However, I am afraid that a lot of proposals will just increase the moral hazard. We have witnessed the fact that the Eurozone had been divided into two parties. Some countries had sound finances and some countries had problems with finances. And when problems came, good countries needed to help the countries with problems. And I think that was the first case of moral hazard that we have witnessed in the Eurozone. On the other hand, we can see moral hazards also in banking union. I'm afraid that that sharing risks will only mean that depositors will be endangered by the necessity to bail out other countries that don't have sound finances. I think that for some countries it might be problems. In the Czech Republic, the banking system is safe and sound. We underwent a special restructuring, but it was only restructured and helped by Czech citizens, so we were able to cope with our problems ourselves. I think that there are problems which have different impact on different countries. I think that a two-speed Europe is not a bad idea, because today we can see that there is a different level of integration in different European countries. Now, regarding harmonization of taxes, I don't think that this is a good way, because in the European Union there will always be countries that will try to have lower taxes, and on the other hand there will always be countries that will prefer to have redistribution in the tax systems, and that they will prefer higher taxes. So I think that it will depend on member states which way they will choose. If we have some kind of, I think that generally the situation will improve the growth. It will be better than to unify the system.
Thank you very much. The other members of parliament that have put their name down will be able to speak later on. Now we have a coffee break and we will start again at 11 o'clock here in the plenary chamber with a debate on the role of national parliaments on the ESM and EMF. Thank you.
Recimo nekako da se on uđe najbliže da je može dobro, samo na pas je pešno treba, ali ona je ulica celko, ima neka ulica da je izgleda.
Može se od ovog hotela mi kako se čini najbliže. Da tu može, da tu može. Od vašeg hotela je jako.
Ne, od Grapa.
Od Grand Pasa je možda 10 minuta. Možda i manje.
To je to hotela, da, to je blizu.
Ta tačka, to mesto mi se čini najbliže bilo u pola 9. Pet minuta je maksimum. 5 minuta maksimum. Amigo. S tim što vi sada imate pauzu za ručak koja traje 2,5 sata.
Odmah, da sve uopšte više ne vidim, ono kao, shvatio sam zaočak, kažem, just more of the same, to mi je ono zeze. Gdje smo razgovarali, bilateralne razgovore smo obavili, već je nešto koji su sastanak. Imam sastanak sa ovim kako su stvarno sam. 11. imam sastanak sa ovim čovjekom sa Kolonijom da mi kaže šta je bilo da ga sa ovim našim ugovorom su uopće. Daj mi ima da zovemo. Gdje je tako? Ne znam. Solite, molim se, Jakobčića, idete gdje je sastanak sa kapitolom za ekonomce. Gdje su tebe onda znači? Da, hoćemo se. Ako bi uzavljaju vani da njima. Ne, završimo s katalonцem. Završimo s katalonцem sastanak. I što se meni čuli idemo. Jer katalonski vis katalonci to je ručno. Znaš šta? Ručno ovdje. Iako je to je on, da. Da. Ja. Bolje da odemo da jedemo nešto stvarno. Znaš, svi ti ručkovi takvi, to je stvarno. Nego... Oni imaju sa Zarkom, ne znam, to je dobro. Ja verujem da će im ići. To naravno. Nego da odemo možemo da odemo do onog čestite učenja zajedno. Pogod, jer ja sam mislio da odem do onoga grila gde smo ti ja večerali. To je meni super. Ovo tu smo pošli. Ne. Tamo, pored našeg hotela je to da 200 metara. I tamo lepo da sedem, da pojedemo nešto. Da je baš ono mesinu, da uzeli gledamo. Da, What? Ja ličim na ove upuškog italijanca što zoput za među kapetačkom. Daj da mi jedemo nešto jedno sa doručku, a sad da stigu dva.
Javit će. Javila se na njegov broj Jasmina i sada će da javi gde je sastanak sa Kataloncem. On je verovatno na nekom sastanku, pa ne može da...
Vidimo se. Ćao.
Idem ja s vama.
Dobro. What?
the mic. Gentlemen, please be so kind to take your seats. Because coffee break is always the most important point in the agenda. It's a good opportunity for networking, but now we should come back to our regular job. Welcome again all of the participants from national parliaments. Welcome our MEPs. And with your permission, I switch into Polish, okay? Otóż, panie I panowie, dzisiejsza...
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, today's plenary session will focus on the current and potential solutions related to the European Stability Mechanism. We are currently working on this in the European Parliament, and so is the European Commission and the Council. We all work on the European Stability Mechanism because it should definitely help us to boost the stability of the whole financial system and the prospects of growth of Europe. It's very important to, first of all, discuss ways in which national parliaments can contribute to the process, also the ways in which what we do here can translate into solutions at national levels. What we also need is good common understanding in this regard. That's why we have taken the decision to make sure that today's debate should focus on, I repeat, the European Stability Mechanism. Obviously, we will also talk about the European Monetary Union and special European Stability Mechanism and its actual application within the European law to make sure it's rightly understood and implemented across the board. To get a full understanding, we need your participation. What we also need you to do is to go with this message to your citizens. I think it's our shared role of ourselves as the European Parliament, but also of the national parliaments. So we have more or less 90 minutes of work together, so let's establish some rules of the game. First of all, how will we speak in today's debate? We wanted to make sure that as many of you can speak as possible. We want to make sure that you have a chance to present your opinions. Obviously, with the limited time that we have, and to guarantee the largest possible number of people to speak, I would like to ask you to stick to your speaking time. 2 minutes maximum, 3 minutes in extreme cases, so to say. So we'll do it as follows: 2 speakers from the national parliaments, and then 1 speaker from the European Parliament. You will see the clock, which will show the time, and I have a special piece of equipment, as you can see in my right hand, which I will use when I need to cut you off or let you know that your time is out. Madam Stoyanova and myself, and Madam Stoyanova is here to represent the presidency. I am here as Vice President responsible for cooperation with national parliaments, so we will both co-chair this meeting. We will also have introductory remarks of people you probably know very well by now, starting with Roberto Gualtieri. So, let us start. I first give the floor to my co-chair, Madam Stoyanova.
Уважаеми господин Либервицки, заместник...
Dear Mr. Liberatsky, Vice President of the European Parliament and host of today's session, dear MEPs and MPs, dear colleagues, Bulgaria is part of the European family for 11 years now, and as the period of the Bulgarian presidency starts, we are going to work for a stronger and more democratic European Union. We're going to work on the deepening of the economic and monetary union, but we don't want this to be at the expense of those member states who are outside of the Eurozone. And that is why it's an honor for me to co-chair the current session, focusing on the subject of the transition from the European Stability Mechanism to the European Monetary Fund, and especially on the role of parliaments in this transition. The stability mechanism was important during the crisis. It gave an additional financial support to members of the Eurozone who were going through trouble. And now this mechanism is going to be transformed into a monetary fund. We believe that member states who are outside of the Eurozone should cooperate with this mechanism until the point of their joining of the Eurozone. And having in mind the budget capacity of the Eurozone, the European Monetary Fund needs the appropriate lending and borrowing capacity and a very clear mandate. That is why today we're going to talk about the institutionalization of the Monetary Fund, and we're going to talk about whether this necessitates a stronger role for the European Parliament and the National Parliament in terms of parliamentary scrutiny. Parliamentary scrutiny capacities can give a chance to national parliaments and the European Parliament to play a significant role in the economic governance in the European Union. We put a special stress on subsidiarity and proportionality, and I would like to invite you to give your general comments on the subject, because this is very important for the debate on the future of Europe as a whole. And having in mind that we are going to hear your comments under the chairmanship of Mr. Liberadzki, let us first hear the panel speakers. The first will be Mr. Gualtieri for introductory remarks. He's the chair of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs of the European Parliament.
Thank you, Chair. There is no doubt that an enhanced crisis management capacity is a necessary component of a better economic and monetary union. And in this respect, we welcome the proposal for a Council regulation on the establishment of the European Monetary Fund. Actually, the name of the new ESM seems, however, misleading, because its task have nothing to do with monetary policy, which is an exclusive competence of the ECB, nor make it closer to what the IMF is. So as a matter of fact, as we know, the Commission is proposing to maintain the current financial stability support functions of the ESM, adding to them the instrument for direct recapitalization of credit institutions, plus the backstop function. So it would hence be wise to keep the current name or to change it in European Stability Fund. But apart of the name, which is important but not decisive issue, of course, the Commission proposal appears well conceived, as it introduces some targeted improvement to the ESM treaty while preserving the current Commission competences in the framework of economic policy coordination and multilateral surveillance procedure. This is positive, as an overlapping of competence would be not only illegal according to your treaties, but also counterproductive in terms of governance coherence. In this respect, it is also important to avoid to task the new ESM with the role of carrying out the macroeconomic surveillance analysis that the IMF performs throughout its Article 4 consultations. It is also positive that the setting up of mechanisms that envisage automatic debt restructuring as a precondition for ESM support has been clearly excluded, and because this would seriously affect financial stability and hence contradict the very mandate of the ESM as defined in Article 136.3 of the Treaty. We have read in this respect some not very useful suggestions of academics, but fortunately, in this case, politicians and central bankers seem more aware of the delicate mechanisms that underpin financial stability. I welcome in particular the very strong position taken in this respect by the French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire, that's clearly said this is a red line. So this will not happen, and is wise. The most relevant feature, however, and that the area where I would like to focus of the Commission proposal is the incorporation of the new ESM into the EU legal framework throughout Article 352 of the Treaty of Function of the European Union. This is essential as it would enhance the institutional coherence and efficiency of our governance framework and would let open the possibility to confer additional tax on the ESM once it is integrated into the Union. To make just an example, with an ESM integrated into the treaties, it would be simpler in the future to establish a macroeconomic stabilisation functions into the EU budget, providing it of a backstop that could be, for instance, the ESM. From a Parliament's perspective, coming to the topic of our specific topic of our discussion, it is also worth noting that, differently from an intergovernmental procedure, an Article 352 procedure, maintaining the unanimity requirement at the level of Member States, will involve into the procedure both the European and the national parliaments, and it would allow the necessary degree of transparency and accountability vis-à-vis both the European and national parliaments. As you know, Article 5 and 6 of the Commission proposal introduce provisions aiming at enhance this parliamentary accountability, according to which the EMF shall submit an annual report to the European Parliament, the Commission, the Council, and also to the national parliaments, and both the European Parliament and the national parliament may request to reply in written to questions and may invite the managing director to appear before them. So we know that in order to discourage member states to follow the 352 procedure, you know, it is the so-called flexibility clause, unanimity at the Council and consent of the European Parliament. Some officials are telling them that the European Parliament would engage in a kind of power grab, going beyond these provisions. This is not true, as we are fully aware that the resources of the ESM are conferred to it by the Member States, and that for this reason it is reasonable that national governments play a decisive role in the governance of that body, as it is envisaged in the Commission proposal. So I hope that also in line with the coalition programme of the new German government, we will be that clearly states that the ESM should be incorporated into the Union law, we will be united in supporting the Commission proposal, not missing the opportunity of making a decisive step forward in enhancement and improvement of the EMU governance framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gualtieri. Now I would like to give the floor. Thank you, Mr. Gualtieri. Now I would like to give the floor to the next keynote speaker, Mr. Norbert Brackmann, member of the Committee on Budget of the German Bundestag.
Meine sehr geehrten Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, what role would the Parliament play? I'd just like to restrict my comments to that to 3 points. First of all, the Commission is assuming that its proposals of the 6th of December 2017 without a change to the European treaties. they're saying that should be possible, but I think that is highly problematic because the European Commission's proposal exceeds the limits of the single authorization aspect. This just illustrates the volume: 80 billion paid up in the ESM with a lending capacity of 500 billion euros. These are not single authorizations of a limited nature, but a procedure to save the whole Eurozone. Now, we are currently discussing this in Germany, and this has given rise to much debate, with reports proving that Article 352 of the Treaty on the way in which the European Union works, the function of the European Union, cannot be the legal base for doing this. Far more important than the pure legal aspect is the political aspect. Can Europe and the monetary union in the longer term exist in two legal spaces with intergovernmental law? The move to European law is certainly a huge challenge, but what would the alternative be? If there is to be a development of the ESM into an EMF for the Eurozone, would that not lead to a two-speed Europe, which is related to the non-Euro countries in the EU? And so we're prepared to see the European Monetary Fund come under European law on the basis of a treaty change, and all national parliaments should be aware of this and should be contributing to making the ESM a European Monetary Fund, because it is only they which can ensure that a mighty instrument such as the European Monetary Fund, that would be far in excess of the budgetary capacity of the Union, would provide a backstop for the resolution arrangement. And if this is anchored in secondary law, then I don't think that this would work in the elections in 2019. The citizens of Europe simply won't accept that way of doing things anymore, and I cannot imagine that the national parliaments will accept it either. I can only speak on behalf of the German Parliament, of course, and we will certainly be not actively participating in that set of choices. The hope, secondly, of the European Commission, that the member states will be prepared to grant significant decision-making powers to the European level instead of that they would be satisfied with reporting to national parliaments. I don't think is correct, because the paid up funds in the ESM and the requirement to provide credits are outside of the EU budget and made available to nation states or member states. And back in 2017, Germany said that it was prepared to have the ESM as the backstop to the resolution mechanism, and that this should be properly covered. But when it comes to risk and liability, you have to have this all in a single operation. But it is ultimately the member states that stand liable, and therefore member states and the national parliaments must continue to have the ultimate control over the European monetary funds, paid up funds. There's a particular characteristic in Germany. The German representative on the board of the ESM, in some cases, is required to report to the German Parliament when it comes to budgetary matters, and it is not possible for them to make a decision on the board without prior mandate given by the German Parliament. And there has been a judgment on the ESM, and this has been confirmed as being a binding requirement. And therefore, in constitutional terms, no German government can have this legitimacy granted between the ESM and the national budgetary authority undermined. And the Commission's proposal, whereby financial aid would be granted simply by the board of by the executive board without participation of the governing board, is not one that would be liable to garner unanimity. Thirdly, Germany wishes to see further developments of the ESM to and does not want to stand in the way of it moving towards a European monetary fund, we think this provides an opportunity because it could be a far more effective method to guarantee budgetary discipline and to get scrutiny of it in member states and to have an early warning system. Article 4 consultations of the International Monetary Fund could be exemplary in that regard. The European Monetary Fund, when it comes to adjustment programs for member states, could replace the existing troika of the IMF and the ECB, but it would have to be an independent European institution, not under the Commission, but alongside the Commission, just as the European Central Bank or the European Investment Bank is. And it would only be an independent institution of that kind that would be able to be responsible for budgetary surveillance and would be able to exercise influence on national parliaments. At the end of the day, it's the European Council that has to make decisions, but with a structure of that kind, it would be at least clear where the analysis ends and where the political responsibility starts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brackman. I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Albuquerque, member of the Committee on European Affairs of the Portuguese Parliament. You have the floor, Mrs. Albuquerque.
Thank you, Chair. Muito bom dia.
Thank you very much. Good morning. In this debate, it's important we recall that the financial crisis, which began in 2007, it evolved and then it transformed into a sovereign debt crisis and then a social and economic crisis which seriously affected many European countries, not just in the Eurozone. This was the largest crisis in years, and it was the largest crisis since the creation of the euro, and this showed the fragility which existed since the beginning of the currency. And we've seen that some progress has been made, but in spite of some ponderousness in the European Union, we see that it is capable of overcoming these problems by creating mechanisms and institutions which will allow us to make up for some of the problems at the start. Now, some have criticized Europe for not having a ready-made response, but we've seen that over the past years a great deal has been done and can be done in spite of the obvious problems which we've seen and heard about on previous occasions. And we've seen specific problems which are linked to the large diversity throughout the European Union. Now, it is true that we would have had better results if we could act more rapidly, but it's true that a great deal has been done. However, a lot remains to be done, and solutions need to be sustainable. The Commission kept its promise of presenting solutions in various areas, and now leaders need to set out goals and timetables to see whether or not they will be fulfilled, but at least there is a political will to move in this direction. The European Union is based on rules, and it's increasingly based on institutions, particularly for issues of accountability, democratic accountability to all European citizens. What we're discussing today, transforming the ESM into an EMF, in spite of the problem of how we may call this fund, what we're trying to achieve is to have a support mechanism for an institution which would have more competencies, which would be more robust, which would be easier to supervise, so it would be more transparent. And it's extremely important to highlight the new competencies of these new institution, this backstop function. This is extremely important for banking union, even though it's not the only missing element. As regards the banking union, and as regards understandings among banks and member states and the problems which may be with refunding banks after problems. This has had major social impacts. Now, on the creation of the banking union, we saw a number of problems, and in spreading out risk, this helped to reduce it. A number of instruments were created, and this has meant that risk has been shared out and reduced, but we need further steps there. Some steps are being made at a central level, and national taxpayers are bearing the cost, and this is something that we need to address. Creating a monetary fund with this responsibility for this backstop function is yet another crucial element. We need to have a calendar for the creation of this monetary fund and deposit guarantee. And the problems we're facing now are similar to those we saw in 2012 and 2013, in spite of everything we've done. We need to avoid a new crisis so that we can move forward and complete this pillar of the banking union. As regards the involvement of parliaments, I feel the Commission's proposal is a balanced one. It sets out a more active role for the European Parliament, which represents us all. But I must recall that this accompanying function and the involvement of citizens, this role also needs to be fulfilled by those in charge in member states, so that they can be present in discussions, in debates, so that they can answer to their own citizens and take a position on this debate. Nor can we relegate this element into the background. It's an important point. We've seen the importance for member states and how national governors are answerable to their citizens and decisions. But what we need to ensure that citizens have as good a view of what's happening as possible. The availability of European leaders to appear before national parliaments is important from an objective point of view, to ensure greater proximity to the European people, but also achieving a link between the European Parliament and national parliaments, and this is done through our democratically elected leaders across all member states who must be answerable to their national parliaments. We hope we'll be able to continue forward in this path. We know there are a number of problems, but we mustn't forget that even though the worst of the crisis is behind us, we need to do a lot more to ensure that we avoid a similar crisis in future. Let's not get entrenched in certain concerns, and let's ensure that we help those who are the most vulnerable and therefore help Europe as a whole. Thank you.
Благодаря ви, госпожо Al-Bakari.
Thank you, Madam Albuquerque. Now I give the floor back to Mr. Liberatsky to continue to chair and moderate the debate.
Thank you, Madam Stoyanova. I would like to remind you, please, there are such a pink papers available. Please fill up and submit us, because we are right now at a very important moment. Let me remind that topic is from the ESM to the EMF. What should be the role of parliaments? And we got kind of a background speech delivered by Roberto. Next, there is two responses. I may say one response we got from Mr. Brackman and also Madame Albuquerque. It's my impression that right now we are in a level, not whether to do it, but how we can do it if we expect to be successful. So I do believe that we have a quite good preparatory background. And as a first speaker, let me invite kindly Madame Fabienne Keller, French Parliament, Vice President of the Committee.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you very much for giving me the floor, Chairman. I have a few thoughts as a senator that sits on the Finance Committee of the French Senate. The first point is about the Eurozone and about the need to strengthen economic policy coordination in the Eurozone, while at the same time respecting, Chairman Stoyanova, the countries that haven't joined the Eurozone. I have a question to ask. Wouldn't it be a better idea to clearly support a budget for the Eurozone, an independent budget beyond the proposal to just have a separate budget line? The second idea I would like to float is linked to what you said, Chairman. You said that this session is focusing on the role of the national parliaments. For us, it's a great pleasure to be here and to meet our colleagues. It's the third time that I take part in a similar event, but I think that we should be meeting even more often, because this coordination between national economic policies and the European economic policy is crucial. And then, of course, there is the important point of defending this policy that Mrs. Albuquerque referred to. We all have to support and embrace these policies because they are ours after all. I would like to have a Eurozone Parliament, not have new MEPs or MPs, but to have similar delegations to the ones that we have here. So we would have members of the European Parliament and members of the national parliaments. And as a former mayor of Strasbourg, I hope you don't mind me saying, I would like the meetings of this new Eurozone Parliament to take place in Strasbourg, which is a European capital. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam, for such a very clear statement. I think it's a good starting point. So, next speaker is Madam Margarita Marros, Assembly, Republic of Portugal, Vice President of the European Affairs Committee.
Muito obrigada, Presidente.
Thank you. The previous speaker already raised an issue which in just 2 minutes I cannot discuss fundamentally with the Parliament and the Eurozone, but nonetheless I'd like to raise 2 clear points. First of all, there is a need for greater coordination within the Eurozone. This means that we're talking about economic governance, which would need to be democratic and ensure democratic oversight. This is a starting point for further reflection on how we can transform the ESM into a European Monetary Fund. These principles of democratic oversight and democratic coordination need to be included in this transformation exercise. And as we feel it is fundamental to ensure this transformation of the ESM into an EMF, this must be done in an integrated approach which is enshrined in the European treaties with respect for European law. And so, in this regard, I would support the proposal made by Mr. Gualtieri as he presented to us, as the Econ Committee presented it, as well as the proposal of Mr. Brackman. In this exercise, we would be trying to create a more robust mechanism, better structured but more flexible, which could come in under the framework of European law and not create new intergovernmental law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to invite Dimitrios Papadimoulis, Vice President of the Parliament, to take floor. Please, Dimitrios.
Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I think that the Commission's proposal to turn the European Stability Mechanism into a European Monetary Fund is a step in the right direction. I agree with the comments made by the chairman of the Economic and Affairs in the European Parliament, Mr. Gualtieri. In other words, that we need to strengthen democratic accountability and the role of the European Parliament when it comes to the scrutiny of these actions. I don't agree with what Mr. Brackman said and his objections, because I think that experience has shown us and taught us that we have to take a step forward, Mr. Brackman. When the crisis struck Europe, and our Portuguese colleague mentioned this, the EU did not have the mechanisms to react, and it set up new mechanisms like the ESM, and before the ESM we had the EFSF. Now that the situation is calmer, we have to lay the groundwork for coping with the next crisis, and we have to strengthen the community method, because the intergovernmental approach on its own has shown that it is too inflexible and too bureaucratic, and it does not protect us from the storm of a future crisis. So we need a stronger union, not in words but in practice. Of course, the national parliaments will play a very important role, but we have to strengthen the role of the European Parliament that is elected by our citizens. And we also have to make sure that we complete the banking union and the economic union as well as the monetary union. Because it is not good for the EU to have the third pillar, which is the deposit guarantee scheme put forward by the Commission a few years ago. It's not good for that to be blocked by a handful of governments in the Council, and two of those governments are the Dutch and German governments. We can't have part of Europe progressing in leaps and bounds like a hare when it is in the interest of big multinational companies and wealthy countries, and we cannot have it moving painfully slowly like a snail or even a crab when we are talking about social cohesion and completing the banking union in order to bolster democratic accountability. I think that meetings like this one today give us reason to have a stronger Europe and more Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Clayton Bartolo from Malta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me start by saying that the fact that the EU will have this fund and it is considering the creation of such a fund is a positive step forward, and it is one which is to be applauded. With hindsight, the financial crisis could have perhaps have been better managed and tackled had such a fund been in place when the crisis struck. And I do believe that yes, as the EU, we need to be prepared should another crisis strike in the future. Just two small points regarding, first of all, the name of this fund. I don't believe that it should be called the European Monetary Fund, because I am of the opinion that this is a little bit misleading, because its functions will be different than what we associate with the International Monetary Fund, and perhaps a different name should be sought. On to a more important issue, as a country being one of the smallest Eurozone countries, although economically outperforming much larger countries, as a Maltese government, we do believe that it is imperative to maintain the current governance structure of the ESM, meaning that unanimity on all voting procedures, as it currently stands, should be maintained. Also, finally, the possibility of using the new fund, let's call it an EMF for now, as a future last resort common backstop of the banking union should be further discussed so as to understand its implications in full. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you and everybody, for such a very exact time regime. Next speaker, please, Mr. Peter Omczyk. Member of Committee on EU Affairs, Netherlands. And by the way, I have a request. Please raise your hands before speaking for camera operator. It's easier to identify your location. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thanks for some very valuable comments. I would like to add a few points to the intervention of Mr. Bachmann, which I fully support. First, on the line of Mr. Dombrovskis this morning, who says that we can have a complete EMU only if we have a democratic EMU, which I think he's right. But 26 parliaments joined the initiative of the Dutch Parliament to sign a declaration and a letter to the Council of Ministers and also to the President of the Eurogroup to make sure that we get at the documents of the Eurogroup and of the Council of Ministers. Right now, we cannot follow how laws are made within the European Union and how decisions are taken within the Eurogroup. I hope we keep fighting for that together, because whatever decision we take, we as parliamentarians have to be able to control decisions, especially when they are about hundreds of billions of euros. Secondly, I'm worried about the enormous risk the European Central Bank has taken by buying 2,500 trillion of government bonds. You've noticed we've been growing for 6 years and still this policy is going on. And it is dangerous. If we now think we can solve the crisis by making more kinds of these emergency funds, which we go on using, and which will be difficult to ever be paid back, and make a systemic crisis even worse, then we're on the wrong track. So please, let's make sure that we create institutions which do not increase the systemic risk in a great recession, but reduce it. And that may be by winding down the asset program of the European Central Bank, the quantitative easing, and by making sure that we don't have enormous funds, because it is first and foremost the responsibility of the own states to solve their problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. According to a rule of the game, let me announce Mr. Bernd Lucke, MEP from Germany.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I will speak in German. Ich möchte
Let me begin by just picking up on what Mr. Gualtieri and Papadimoulis said and contradict what they said, because I think what they excluded was the linking of responsibility and liability. Now, it is one we're loath to tackle, but it's very important when you set up institutions. You mustn't turn a blind eye to it. And Mr. Gualtieri mentioned the kind of less helpful proposals that have come in from the academic world, saying that the EMF should not have powers for insisting on restructuring before new credit aid comes to the fore. But I think it is essential. What we need to ensure is that the EMF can only grant monies, credit, if the debt situation of the country is being helped and is being put on a sustainable long-term basis. And if that's not the case, then it is essential that debt restructuring measures take place, and that debt restructuring must be done at the cost of the creditors and not for the EMF. And it is important to ensure that there isn't as much political or politicizing as has been the case so far. In the International Monetary Fund, there is analysis, and that's almost the exact opposite of what the analysis that is being done by the European Commission for certain countries. So we need to make sure we've got a body, an institution that can carry out proper independent analysis of the debt situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, let me invite kindly Mr. Nicholas Manios, Chair of Social Affairs Committee, Greece.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Even though I am not an economist, I believe that transforming the ESM into an EMF will be a milestone in the completion of the European project. It will be a lever that we can use to reduce the disparities between the member states. We heard that the European Monetary Fund can contribute to a two-speed Europe. I don't know how many speeds there are in Europe, how many gears there are in the EU at the moment, but it's not the euro that is guilty of this. At least it's not the euro's fault on its own. This isn't why we have a two-speed Europe. It is the policies that are being implemented that are to blame. There are disparities between member states, but there are also problems within member states. These policies hold the key if we want to solve the problem. If we have an EMF that stems from the acquis, won't have any of the features or any of the concepts and mindset of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. We have a very bad example when it comes to the IMF being involved in Europe. I'm going to talk about Greece, about my country. What were the IMF's proposals? Get rid of the acquis, abolish labor law, huge budget cuts. And what did they tell us at the end? They came around and said that they made a mistake, that their policies were wrong, and that their recipe was not successful. That's what they turned around and said. So I think that the EU has to shoulder the historic responsibility that lies on its shoulders, and it has to make the most of this tool that will be able to nip problems in the bud and that will be able to solve problems that occur in the member states and on a European level.
Thank you very much. As the next speaker, please, Ms. Birgit Malzak-Winkemann, Committee on Budget, Bundestag.
Jetzt. Okay.
President, ladies and gentlemen, from the point of the AfD Bundestag party, the transformation of the ESM into an EMF needs to be done in keeping with EU law, and the feeling of the European that Germany feels that under the Lisbon principle we need to ensure that if we're looking at budgetary control and national parliaments, and the EU is getting involved in the national affairs of parliaments. And according to our German authorities, this is part of the identity duties which must be bound to integration to ensure that the responsibility of the EU without excluding the possibility of turning to the European people. And as Mr. Brackman has already said, the Article 352 procedure, which is here the legal basis, this in 1996 was referred as a limitation which prevents the powers of the European Parliament from being extended beyond its scope of validity. But in any case, we cannot accept going beyond the financial matters. Earlier this year, the German National Bank referred to an amount of 882 billion euro, and this is greater than this is 3 times the national budget in Germany, and this is higher than the current crisis, the current debt in the European Union. We need to ensure we shouldn't be biting the hand that feeds us. And given the rulings of the European Court of Justice and German courts, that the European Union is not respecting its competencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Paolo Guerrieri Paleotti, Italian Senate.
Yes, thanks very much. I think how to name the new institution, transforming the ESM is quite a substantial problem, because, if we stick to the proposal of the Commission, what Mr. Gualtieri has been also presenting us, I think the European Monetary Fund is not exactly, how to name the new institution. But if we just, been listened to our colleague, German colleague Brackman, I think the EMF is perfectly feasible, because I want to better understand. I mean, your proposal is quite symmetrically opposed to what the Commission is today proposing, because first of all, it's very clear that what you're saying is to transfer the responsibility for crisis management and lending to the new EMF. So this is going to, de facto, eliminate the present Commission role in defining structural disequilibria, and even more important, the kind of adjustment program and how to implement them. So from this point of view, it's very clear that the new EMF should the lending should be limited as a rule to countries that have lost or risk losing market access. And we have been heard, plus the restructuring corollary. I mean, from this point of view, this is a very, very different kind of proposal about the new function of this new stability mechanism. And about the governance, at the end of the story, is not so much the control of national parliament, but it's very clear that the EMF in German proposal, or what you express, is like a direct instrument of the creditor countries. So it's going to be, from this point of view, for me, very unclear how this could lead to greater democratic accountability vis-à-vis the European Parliament and the other national parliament. So I would like to, to ask you some more comments, because I want to be, better understand what is this position with in confront with the other one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. List of speakers willing to speak on behalf of national parliaments is already exhausted. So let me ask all the speakers with introductory remarks to make their comments on what has been already said, and also on what do they think it's appropriate to tell at this very moment. So, Roberto Gualtieri, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I think it's been a very, very important and useful discussion, which clearly shows the added value this conference, interparliamentary conference, bringing together parliamentarians and from different parliaments and contexts and narratives, and asking all of us the effort to understand each other. I would like to make some comment, especially, of course, to the one made by Mr. Brackman, because as also other colleagues have noted, we were in different lines, let's say. But sometimes I think a lot of these agreements are, in my view, also a misunderstanding. So I would like also to better understand the position of Mr. Brackman. Of course, there is an issue of relating to the tasks. What tasks we give to this body? And here I see a disagreement because, of course, what Mr. Brackman was suggesting, to give to this body the role, but that basically is currently the role of the European Commission, to tasked by the treaty to make surveillance, economic surveillance, fiscal surveillance, to implement the treaty provisions and the stability group provision. To give this role to the ESM would be a totally different world. And honestly, this would also be, I think, politically not desirable, because the European Commission is accountable to the Council and the Parliament, so is an independent body which has an economic policy function so deep that even enforcing fiscal rules, defining, so would be a totally different concept of what is economic policy, economic governance. And by the way, this would require a very broad treaty change, because to change the article of the treaty which confers such competence to the European Commission and take out this competence from the Commission, give to another body, is a major overhaul of all our treaties, which would require the full treaty change, referendum in member states. So we are talking, honestly, to something that does not exist. So if we say this, basically we are saying we are not changing anything, we are keeping the ESM as it is, or we make a small intergovernmental change just to add the backstop. So at the end it's the same, because if honestly, I don't think anybody here in this room might think that it's realistic to conceive a total global treaty change, even independently of how we might agree or disagree. I think is a mistake would be to move the economic policy function from the surveillance function from the European Commission to this body. But independently from that, it's totally unrealistic that such a deep change of our treaty would happen. So I think this is not at the end even a point of discussion, because it's something that is not in the table really. So what is on the table is whether we want to make this additions of competences to the ESM, that is the backstop, the direct recapitalization, the possibility to act without, not necessarily with the IMF, but also without the IMF if necessary. By the way, also the possibility to ask debt restructuring, because currently the ESM does have this possibility. What we are discussing, and everybody is excluding at the end, is that we make this changes from a possibility to an obligation. And why all the central bankers, all the people involved in managed public debt know that if you transform a possibility in obligation, it is not negative but positive. Because if you have an obligation, that immediately adds financial stress on the sovereign debt market. So you create more, you make more likely to have to add instead of less likely, because you are increasing the spreads, and while this faculty, which is an extreme possibility to restructure sovereign debt, it should remain an option, not an obligation, as it is now, and it is reasonable. So, but apart from that, the other tasks are tasks where there is agreement, and why it should be more efficient to do this via Article 352 and not intergovernmental. First, that's really a point I would like to ask to Mr. Branca. You said that because we need to involve all member states in the decision, including non-euro area member states. This is exactly what the 352 procedure does, because it's unanimity by all 28 member states. So exactly this problem that you saw is, let's say, solved by the procedure of 352. Then you correctly say that national parliaments, as far as they make their government accountable, should keep having a stronger role than the European Parliament. And this is exactly what the European Commission proposal does, because what currently exists, for instance, in Germany, then the government into the ESM has to be accountable to the Bundestag, will be maintained, fully maintained. It's not changed at all by the proposal of the European Commission. What the European Commission does, it adds on top of the existing accountability of national parliament, that is not changed at all, just add an additional accountability framework, which is not just the accountability of a parliament with its own government, but the fact that national parliaments, you will have the possibility to hold accountable not only your member state member of the ESM, but the whole ESM, the managing director, not just your minister, but Mr. Regling, and you could call him to come to the national parliament, and you will have to discuss the annual report of ESM. So what the Commission is proposing does not take out anything from the current powers of national parliaments, but adds an additional power to contribute to keep accountable the SM, the whole SM, and not your own only member state representative. So this is, I mean, a very good thing, I think, as it is a very good that the European Parliament could do the same and discuss with Mr. Regling and discuss the annual report of ESM and have a hearing about the ESM rule. So here again, I think that talking each other, we understand each other, and sometimes there are also what I would describe as more misunderstanding that real disagreement. Because as I said, the European Parliament, while supporting the integration to your treaty, is not against the fact that there is a special responsibility of governments and national parliaments, exactly because there are their resources that are pooled into the SM. There was a discussion on the Target 2 and the ECB QE, but frankly speaking, I don't know what has to do with the ESM. So it's another discussion, and exactly the call of independence that many of you did is valid also for the ECB. So ECB is an independent institution. Monetary policy is not political, and so we of course, it's a very interesting discussion about QE, Target 2, but I think that it has nothing to do with the ESM and its transformation in the EMF. So finally, it's true that an enhanced ESM would be conducive also to further steps of EMU deepening and completion, including the fiscal capacity, what my French colleague called the euro area budget, because would give more depth. But this is something, again, with just a possibility that we will have, is not something that is automatically provided by the adoption of the Commission proposal, because the Commission proposal keeps the existing function of the ESM plus direct recapitalization of bank and backstop to SRF. All the rest is a new possibility we'll have for the future, and in any case, every member state will have its say and could veto or discuss or agree. So again, while doing this will not prevent us to make a further step forward, while avoiding this would prevent us, but again, those who don't agree with this thing are not already subscribing this option by supporting the Commission proposal. So, to come to conclusion, as I said, I find the Commission proposal on ESM, EMF, a part of the name, very balanced, and I think that a thorough exam of all these aspects, including of the legal basis, would come to the conclusion that this would be a balanced compromise. And honestly, I was a bit surprised also because I read the program of the German coalition, which I think is very clear and goes in this direction. Now I heard a totally different interpretation from Mr. Brackman, that was in the coalition Westrach. So, of course, I look forward also to understand what is the meaning of those two sentences that, for me, are very positive in the coalition program of the German political forces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Roberto Gualtieri, for your comments. Now I'd like to ask Mr. Norbert Brackmann to take floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me that opportunity. It's become fairly clear in the course of this discussion that there are different concepts, different ideas about the purpose of such a monetary fund, or whatever you might want to call the thing. During the financial and state debt crisis, we brought in an arrangement with the ESM in Europe, which was to provide a guarantee that were such crises to re-emerge in Europe at any point, there would be this arrangement to provide protection. This is the basic function of the ESM as it is today. Now, the discussion as to the purpose of it is being extended to a completely different task, not that of an insurance, but a macroeconomic prevention arrangement in the time of crises to help balance out social differences in Europe, and the lending capacity and funding, which has to be given proper political backing, is really called into question as a result, and this is the objective of what the Commission's proposal is. And I think that being the case, you have to try and establish, as Mrs. Keller from France said, if you want to set about these new tasks, then you have to stand together in solidarity and finance these new tasks together, and this is perhaps something for the multi-annual financial framework or a different kind of strengthening of the different programs. But what we mustn't do is provide we mustn't call into question this insurance scheme we have for difficult crises, because if we take into the huge amount of money, including the requirement for member states to pay up, and leave that up to the market, then we might well be fanning the flames of further crises, and this would then come about. Bad economics make bad policy, as the Brits like to say, and the means that we would have by way of an insurance would then deprive us of the very wherewithal we would need to sort things out. Now, the reference to the German coalition agreement, if you read that carefully, you will see that on this precise point the coalition partners have not reached agreement and are therefore saying that it doesn't say that it supports the German government, but that it should come under union law and existing laws need to be upheld. And really, I think this illustrates the fact that there's a huge amount of further requirement for debate on the way that that is to be done.
Thank you very much, Madam Brackman. As the next speaker is Madam Maria Luis Albuquerque.
Thank you, Chair. I would agree with some of what has been said, particularly Mr. Gualtieri. I also believe that the Commission proposal is balanced, actually. And I understand that it's possible to try and read out of it things that are, for me, not there. But what I feel is that in some points of this discussion, we are stuck at the exact same point we were in 2012 or 13, that the same concerns are still present, that the same suspicion about what the Commission would want to do with this proposal is not much different from what we have seen in the past few years. The involvement of the IMF was a necessity because we were not prepared to face a crisis. We were not prepared to set the necessary arrangements to support countries facing difficulties, and yet we should be able to do it on our own. This is not saying that we will not look for the support of the IMF. We are also members of the IMF, all of us, although all of us who had problems, but we are mostly European, so we should try and have this setting within our rules, within our treaties, within our institutions. I would agree with Mr. Gualtieri that there is some misunderstanding here and some preconceptions about this division between creditors and debtors. That is probably still a result from the crisis, a result from negative reactions felt in public opinions on both sides, and the blame game that we always see when there are countries in difficulty and others willing to come in their support. And my concern is that if we continue to be stuck in these preconceptions, that we won't move. We won't move fast enough. We won't go deep enough to actually prevent another crisis. If we say that we have to do, as Mr. Gualtieri said, stepping up from the possibility of restructuring to the obligation of restructuring, we know how these things in the financial markets become self-fulfilling prophecies. We know that putting it in writing, making countries move in that direction will actually lead to that result. Even if we still have many difficulties and some of the countries are still struggling with issues of sustainability, I think it's undeniable to everyone how far we have come, how much we have progressed, and how much safer we are today than we were a few years ago. But this is clearly not enough. If now, by trying to strengthen an institutional framework, we contribute to include further elements to promote a new crisis, we may find ourselves in a position that before we even set this new institutional framework, we will be handling a new crisis again. And we will then be talking about Europe in different speeds, 2 speeds, 3 speeds, and actually the difference in speeds may be such that some will be left behind for good. And this is completely contrary to what we all have been struggling to reach in the past few years. So whether these are misunderstandings or different political views, understanding and obviously respecting the different political views, I think it is important to have a more balanced approach. I would say let's not try to see in the Commission proposal what is not there, and if needed, make it even clearer. If the question or the doubts are about what is meant in what is written, then write it more clearly so that there are no doubts. I don't see in the Commission proposal the reasons for the concerns mentioned here, namely by Mr. Brackmann, but if that is the understanding of the German Bundestag or part of the German Bundestag, then maybe we can solve it by drafting it more clearly. And the issue of democratic accountability, which is actually the main topic of our discussion, even if we tend to go a little to the side of that point, let's also not forget that making it accountable to the European Parliament is indeed making it accountable to all our citizens, because members of the European Parliament are elected directly by all our citizens, making it the leaders of the institutions, the managing director, also responsible for meeting national parliamentarians, sending the reports, responding to the questions that national parliaments want to pose. That will increase these accountability procedures, that will improve the perception. But again, I would insist, it is key that the national governments also take the ownership of the reforms and proposals that are being discussed at the European level, and that they defend them before their parliaments, so that there is a more direct link between what is being decided here in Brussels or in Frankfurt or Strasbourg or whatever, and what people actually feel on the different countries across Europe. That is a key that cannot be changed. And also I'd like to appeal to whatever the form of the final agreement is, that we are not, I understand the concerns of those who plea for the continuation of unanimity in many decisions, but we want to create mechanisms that are efficient, that are able to respond, and we all know that unanimity rules, when it comes to taking specific decisions, give very powerful instruments that can be misused. So if the rules are clearly defined, if the whole framework is accepted by all unanimously, then we must create institutions who have the necessary flexibility to actually act timely. Because if we spend too much time discussing, then when we finally reach a decision, it just comes too late. So if that will be the case, there is no point in us all spending too much time on discussing the framework. It has to be efficient. When we are talking about financial markets, speed is of the essence. If we are not able to act fast, then acting will do no good. So let's keep that in mind. Let's define the rules very, very clearly. Let's agree on those rules by unanimity, but then let's us have a mechanism that works, even if there is one country that sometimes for specific reasons which have nothing to do with the issue being discussed, take a position which is not reasonable and can be actually very, very harmful for the Union as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are coming slowly but coming to the end. Let me make the following observations. First of all, we're thinking about focusing on a very important topic, and I do believe that Chair Gualtieri and myself made a proper decision. We are focused on what will be the role of parliaments and during our way from ESM to the EMF. Next, I do believe that what is as a result that all of us who are very much focused on how to make future of the Union and future of Europe better. Next, safer economy. But I read the following 4 crucial points. First, we need mutual understanding. Second, we need trust. National parliaments should trust the European Union's institution, beginning from European Parliament. We should trust you, the national parliaments. Next point, transparency. It was a call, don't do anything in the way which is, let's say, cabinet way or secret way. It should be transparent. And last but not least, efficiency. We should be convinced that we are able to achieve expected results, effect. If there is efficiency, we can expect that our future debate will be ongoing. Our intention is at the European Parliament to have inclusive character of the debate. We want to invite everybody who is able, who has a good will, who has a capacity, who has time to contribute to this debate about better Europe. Still, there is an early stage, so don't afraid to be together. It was a great pleasure to chair